Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. I'd like to talk about not simply the Russian-Ukrainian war, but more why the war hasn't been brought to an end, and the view that some have, and quite a few have, including Konstantin Kisin and his team there, production team, scripting team, that they seem to think if only Trump, President Trump, had a better understanding of Russian psyche and Russian sort of attitudes and views, their accumulated paranoia over centuries. Now, if only he understood that, then it would be a done deal. Now, I reject that out of hand. I think that's absolute nonsense. And Konstantin, as much as I look at a lot of his stuff, and I do like it, by the way, and it's rare that he doesn't raise at least one interesting point in his business. But the idea that he's a comedian, and the idea that translates easily into being a master geopolitical analyst, I think that's a stretch. But I do like his delivery. He has again, a good production team, but I do like his delivery. He has that way of being sort of suggesting or implying that he's searching for the truth while being forthright, but also being deferential and not wanting to go out of his way to offend. And that's a good mix, and it comes across very well on his delivery. Nonetheless, coming back to the issue of now, when President Trump was or candidate Trump at the time was campaigning for the presidency, he did mention the war a number of times and suggested he had policies that would bring it to an end, or he could bring the parties to the table and bring it to an end. Now, and was suggesting that the war was a black hole of not only American taxpayer money, but a lot of young men being fed into the mincing machine for no useful or practical geopolitical purpose. Now, there were hawks around saying we have to show Putin who's boss, we have to kick his Russian ass. And then on the other side, there were those who were saying, well, this is actually not accomplishing anything. Why don't we try and find a negotiated settlement? I favoured the latter there. I thought a negotiated settlement was going to be far better than any other outcome that was going to be achieved through military means or brute force or whatever. Now, this view that if only Trump understood, or Trump and his team and his advisors and geopolitical advisors and military advisors, if they only understood the Russian psyche, then they could understand Putin. Then if they understood Putin, then they could reach some sort of an agreement. Or so. I reject that. That's bullshit in my view. Putin made it abundantly clear over a long period of time that do not have a NATO member with a border directly adjacent to Russia. Don't do it. That's a line. If you cross it, then we can't be friends. Now, he was pretty clear about that. I don't think there's anything ambiguous in the points he's making. As if you wanted to count up the speeches, they would be public speeches and public proclamations that he's made. I think it's abundantly clear that was his don't cross this line. And so when NATO or the globalists, the globalists, when they toppled the Ukrainian government some years ago and installed a puppet, and then started having NATO discussions, not to mention the Baltic states like Latvia, Lithuania, and all that sort of stuff, trying to get them into NATO, Finland and the likes. Clearly, the Russians were going to have to respond. So, and they did. And so this idea of Putin just attacked out of the blue. That's because he's a crazed dictator. He's like Hitler. And I mean, Hitler, everything is Hitler these days. Trump wants to send illegal aliens back to Mexico or something. Hitler. When the conflict, by the way, in Ukraine, there was a sort of a rogue Ukrainian. Again, they've gone down the Nazi path. There's a rogue Ukrainian group in eastern Ukraine where that section or province of Ukraine is primarily Russian, and a deal could have easily been negotiated to cede that to Russia based on a plebiscite that could have been, handled by completely independent, impartial election observers and election analysts and so on. They could have managed the whole thing. So there was every opportunity to avoid conflict and every opportunity to reach negotiated settlements on all fronts. So I believe, certainly for my observation, Putin would have taken any of those. He doesn't want the cost and the aggravation of having to go to war. He doesn't want the cost and aggravation of dealing with sanctions and all this sort of stuff. I mean, he doesn't need that. No one does. The blowing up of that pipeline was deliberate. This is the gas pipeline going to Germany. I think that was deliberate sabotage. And now there's very strenuous efforts being made to sabotage the possibility of repairing that pipeline. So there's a lot of globalist politics are going on here, and this idea that Putin's the bad guy is simply a narrative. Now, is Putin the sweetest guy in the whole universe? Well, no, but that's not the point. He's a world leader of a substantial nation with a population of 140 odd million and that sort of stuff, and they have a lot of nuclear weapons. So you'd think you'd want them brought to the table rather than try and have a conflict with them, especially a proxy conflict they're doing now with some flunky stooge they installed, the globalists installed in Ukraine as the president. Now, there's no question that the war with Russia is a globalist gig. Ukraine is just the pawn, just the fodder that's being put up there. So the globalists want the conflict, and the globalists are outraged that Russia is resisting all globalist efforts at having gay pride parades and lesbians, drag queen lesbians reading story out to 3-year-old children. So Putin's resisting all that globalist social, gender, racial division nonsense, and this outrages the globalists because that's their sort of point of entry, and their subversion handbook when they go into any country, whether it's Australia or America or anywhere else. And so Putin won't have any of it, and so they figure they got to take him out. Nor is Putin vulnerable to bribes. Otherwise, they would have offered him a waterfront mansion in Rhode Island or something. So they can't corrupt him, they can't bribe him, and they can't get rid of him. And so this is the outrage that the globalists have for Putin. And so this is why he's depicted in such a negative light. Coming down to the Russian psyche, now Konstantin Kisin and others, by the way, so I'm not singling out Mr. Kisin. He did a video over the last few days where he came out with, well, look at what's happened in Russia. The Mongols, Russia was almost like just a province, a satrapy of the greater Mongol Empire for quite some time. Then there were various invasions, whether you're looking at Napoleon Bonaparte or whatever, or the Swedish invasion and so on. And this, Konstantin argues, has given the Russian people and the Russian state and the Russian body politic a certain type of paranoia and trepidation that is reflected in their behavior and their attitudes to NATO, creeping eastward, and all this sort of stuff. No, I don't dispute that as a sort of a general overall summary, but that misses the point. I think Putin was eminently available for a deal. He didn't need any of the aggravation that's going on now, and had the globalists decided, no, we don't want to bait him, we don't want to put NATO right at it. No, we don't want to have an anti-Russian government in Ukraine that's going to antagonize Putin. We don't need that. Better we cut a deal, better we all agree, and better we keep the peace, and better we, that would have been the best. And those options were all there. And I would argue it was not that they couldn't have put a crummy deal to Putin and he would have said no, but the option of cutting a deal and Putin being eminently available to discuss a reasonable deal, that was always there and always available. I say it's the globalists that didn't go down that path. And so it eventually led to a conflict, which the globalists would have known was coming. The idea that they're so, oh, we're shocked, we didn't know Putin. No, that's bullshit. So I don't think the Russian psyche or that Genghis Khan once rampaged through Russia, 1,000 years ago. I don't think any of that's relevant to cutting a deal. I think that was always on the table, regardless of Russian paranoia or psyche or whatever. Now, once the eastward creep of NATO happened, and once there was the deliberate subverting of the Ukrainian government and turning it from being the neutral state into a state hostile to Russia, once that started, then you could say the Russian psyche sort of but then any country would have reacted that way. I don't think that's a uniquely Russian gig. Now, let me talk about paranoia and a quiet paranoia and the ability to hang on through the centuries, hang on to sort of, I don't know, like a paranoid DNA almost. When I first started business traveling as a young man, I just assumed that the social trust, or the lack of paranoia, if you want to call it that way, in Australia was more or less, I mean, give or take, it was more or less the baseline. And not that a country that hadn't been racked by civil war for 50 years, where the people from there wouldn't be, have a different view of things. They would. I mean, that was obvious. But generally, I thought the baseline was more or less about how it was in Australia. So I was quite shocked when I started business traveling about how the social trust in Australia, on a relative, it wasn't perfect. The social trust in Australia on a relative basis was very high indeed. And any country that was set up by the British has, as in colonial, has a set up by colonial, as in white people, has a very high level of social trust. So, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain, Scotland, and so on. So the level of social trust on a relative, again, it's not perfect, but the level of social trust was very, very high in certain places and not so in others. Now, the reasons for lack of social trust in other countries varied. For example, in China, the government has a very bad name in terms of rando and arbitrary taxation and seizure of property, killing people and all this sort of thing. So the only people you can trust are your blood relatives. That's it. The only people you can trust are people you can control. So if you don't have a device through which, this is China, if you don't have a device through which you can shame other people in the way you can your relative, if you don't have that, then you don't have control. Therefore, you cannot trust. And even the Chinese that are born in Australia, or certainly Chinese lived in Australia for years, trying to do business with them is like, pushing shit uphill with a sharp stick. It's hard work. They have zero trust, and they don't know how to trust. To them is just gullibility. It's naivete and gullibility. That's all it is. And so they have no conception of a high trust society. They just don't know what it is. Now, the same goes as you travel around, say, other parts of Asia, say with the exception of Japan, where, and again, you've got a very homogenous nation and very proud, long traditions, and they haven't really had much in the way of invasion. I think the last attempt, other than the American occupation, the last attempted invasion was, I think, like 1200 AD or something. I think that's where the kamikaze comes from. The divine wind, a storm came along and sank the Chinese fleet that was trying to invade Japan. So other than Japan, though, pretty much every region around the world, whether you go to South America, whether you go to Africa or even particularly Eastern Europe, the social trust is, on a comparative basis, very low, bordering on non-existent. Now, they've got different ways of dealing it. The Chinese is going with blood relatives. Same in other parts of Asia as well. Now, it's different when you're the rich white business or company that's disgorging lots of benefits and doing lots of handouts. Then social trust doesn't matter because you're just pouring money and throwing gifts and baubles at them. But the minute that stops, then suddenly the whole thing comes to a shuddering halt, and then the lack of social trust sticks out like a sore thumb. They're all very trustworthy when you're showering them with gifts, but or they trust you when you're showering with gifts. But the minute the gifts stop, then they default back to their habit. Now, the social trust devices differ. So now, say in France, for example, we're trying to understand the nation state hasn't really existed for that long in the overall scheme of things. So the idea of a homogenous people within a nation that develop high levels of social trust, that's relatively new. And only where you see continuity of institutions over a long period of time do you see the high level of social trust. So the social trust in Australia was inherited from the social trust of the British. It wasn't something that just magically sprang out of the ground. So now if you look at Britain or England, say, just for the moment, the only disruption to their institutions in terms of invasion or outside sort of influence came when William the Conqueror in 1066. So England hasn't been invaded since 1066. Not that it hasn't had its twos and fro's, it like had a civil war, for example, that type of thing. But its institutions have had, on a relative basis, and compared to the rest of the world, have had astonishing levels of continuity. And this is reflected in how social trust developed, in the way it developed. For example, there was still class conflict where the working class wouldn't trust the upper class and vice versa. There were those sort of things were there, but generally person to person, the social trust was very high. Now, Germany, for example, the borders of Germany have changed like a gazillion times. And it wasn't a nation until 1871, a federated nation. There were the German states and tribes, but they didn't federate till 1871. So it's quite a new nation in nation state terms. Now, Germany was at the European crossroads. So if you were sort of the major powers of the day, sort of Spain and France, if you wanted to invade, you wanted to go east, you went through Germany. If you were the Russians or the other folks from the east, then heading west, then you would go through Germany. So Germany was the sort of the thoroughfare, and travellers to Germany would note that there were vast areas, 20 miles either side, farmland, prime farmland, 20 miles either side of the highways where there was no farming done. It wasn't worth it. There's so many armies crisscrossing up and down, and they would just requisition everything they wanted and clean you out. You'd have nothing left when they came through for farming. So no one bothered farming. It just wasn't worth the act of putting the time and energy into creating a functioning farm only to have it torn to pieces by a travelling army. So now the borders of France have changed goodness knows how many times. France wasn't really a nation until the 1500s. Or later, moving into the 1500s, and France was broken up into all sorts of different provinces and places, and so the borders would change when one province would become part of the France, then it wouldn't be, and then it would again. And today the nation of Belgium used to be northern France, or most of it used to be northern France. The area around Alsace and Lorraine and Strasbourg has changed hands about 1 million times. And so on. So the idea of hard borders and homogenous population, this wasn't this isn't a thing, or wasn't a thing. A lot of places that there were constant invasions, there were constant occupations by foreign powers imposing very different laws and requirements and shifting power balances at the apex and changes in arbitrary taxation and all sorts of stuff. So, if you get looking east, Poland, for example, has existed as a nation that didn't exist for over 100 years. Then it was part of the Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania. Sweden used to be a major power in the region of Northern Europe, occupying parts of Poland and what today is Finland and the Baltic states and parts of what today is Belarus and so on. So borders have shifted, and administrations and governments and imposition of governments have shifted all the time. Now, you can pretty much look at the level of paranoia, and you can plot it against the continuity of the institutions, where you have low continuity, that is constant invasions, constant changing of borders, influxes of all sorts of other people, and so on. Then you have low social trust, and you could plot one to the other. That's it, as night follows day. Where you have higher level continuity of institutions, then you have higher levels of social trust. So whether you're looking at Russia, its invasions, or you're looking at the Balkans with the Turkish occupation, Roman occupation, and goodness knows what sort of occupation, then you see in the Balkan states very low levels of social trust there. So as I traveled around on business, I was staggered at social trust is almost non-existent in some places. Everything is, you have to rely on sort of deviousness and double dealing and all sorts of snide treacheries to get through the day. And they believe that that's all, that's the only thing you can do. There is nothing else you can do to survive. You must do that if you're going to survive. So they have no concept of trust and continuity and faith in one another. No. And they look at us, you try and explain it to them, they just look at you blankly and stare. I've spoken to a lot of East Europeans, whether they be Russians or other East Europeans, and not all. The Poles probably are maybe not that bad, but them too. And they have no concept of social trust. And again, they just see that they can't even comprehend the social trust of the Western countries. They just see it as a strange mass of gullibility and naivety and stupidity, and boy, are you asking to be exploited. They just see it that way. And they can't see the value of social trust in building. Why are rich countries high social trust countries? They just can't get it into their heads. They just don't know. Oh, you must have stolen it. There can't be another reason. So only long-term institutional continuity provides for. Even in Germany, I would rate the Germans as paranoid. Not all, but I'd rate the Germans as paranoid. The accumulated centuries of them being crisscrossed by all sorts of invading armies and World War I and II and all this sort of thing has given them a paranoia. You can see we're surrounded by enemies and we have to strike first, and this type of thing. And you see that woven into their psyche, and even in their business dealings, you see that. It's not overt to the bad where they won't trust you like the Chinese, that sort of thing. But they always have that level of, certainly the ones I've dealt with, they always have that level of doubt and suspicion there that just hovers and hangs over the business discussion. Not to the point of crass vulgarity or something, but it's there. You see it. And I pretend not to. I just pretend I'm ignoring it or that I haven't noticed it. But because to call it out would simply heighten their suspicion. So there's a lot of people around the world that think you're out to screw them because that's how things work. That's what they're used to. Or you look at somewhere like England with its long continuity where it hasn't happened. So I don't accept this idea that Russians have some unique paranoia, and if only Trump understood this, then a deal could be done. I don't buy that for a minute. I think the opportunity for a deal that was there for years could have been done, and now it's not. So Putin is now in a position where no. If we're going to sort this out, I need this, this, and this. Oh, what an outrage! But no, I think that attitude or that response has been encouraged by constant, endless provocation and refusal to cut a deal when it could easily have been done. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.